The Inquisition doesn't want you to know that somewhere in the underhive of Necromunda, there's a servitor conducting an illegal rave with 10,000 people screaming prayers to the beat of repurposed Prometheum pumps. I know because I was sent to shut it down, and what I found changed everything I thought I understood about the Imperium. The coordinates arrived on my data slate, transmitted through channels so encrypted that even reading them probably violated a dozen administratum protocols. My handler, Interrogator Vex, had included only 3 words of instruction: observe, document, survive. No tactical briefing, no support squad, no extraction plan. Just an access code for a cargo lifter that would take me down past the enforcer zones, past the guild territories, past even the reclamation levels where corpse starch factories process the hive's endless dead into tomorrow's rations. I was heading into the true underhive, where the Imperium's light didn't reach and its laws meant nothing. The lifter descended for 40 minutes, the counter spinning past level markers that hadn't been maintained in centuries. At -108, the lifter shuddered to a halt, and I stepped out into darkness cut only by bioluminescent fungi growing in patches across rusted walls. The sound reached me before my eyes adjusted. Not music, not yet, but a pulse that traveled through the decking and up through my boots into my bones. I followed it through passages that had probably been maintenance corridors during the dark age of technology, now thick with condensation and biomatter feeding on toxic runoff from the factorums above. The pulse grew stronger with every turn, until I could feel my heartbeat trying to synchronize with it. The chamber opened like a cathedral, and the comparison felt blasphemous and perfect. It had been a Prometheum storage facility, massive tanks hollowed out and lined with scavenged acoustic materials that turned them into resonance chambers. Cables thick as my arm ran between them, jury-rigged power systems stealing energy to fuel whatever miracle of engineering I was witnessing. The servitor stood at the center. It had been human once, but whoever modified it had stripped away the behavioral inhibitors, freeing its motor systems to move in ways servitors weren't designed for. Its industrial manipulator claws rose and fell in perfect tempo, conducting an orchestra of repurposed machinery, mining equipment, factorum systems, even pieces of a demolished chimera transport, all synchronized to produce sound that was more felt than heard. The crowd numbered in the thousands. Gang members from organizations that should have been killing each other, factorum workers still wearing shift markers, even mid-hivers whose cleaner augmetics marked them as dangerously out of place. None of that mattered here. The music had dissolved every boundary. Bodies moved together so close that individual space ceased to exist, thousands of people breathing in synchronization. The air was thick with chem smoke obscura, obviously, but also stimulants I'd never encountered, probably cooked in illegal laboratoriums using stolen precursor chemicals. A woman danced near me, her body a map of underhive survival, one arm replaced with a pneumatic prosthetic salvaged from mining equipment, her face bearing acid burns healed into colloids, her eyes augmented with cheap optics that glowed faintly red. She moved with absolute abandon, her augmetic arm creating its own rhythm within the larger symphony. Sweat covered her, and on her face was pure, unguarded joy. The light came from scavenged sources, phosphorescent fungi pulsing in time with the sound, broken auspex arrays painting cascading patterns across the ceiling, even a dismantled servitor skull strobing in rhythms that probably caused permanent retinal damage. Everything was stolen, broken, transformed. The Imperium built machines for war and production, but down here, someone had learned to make them sing. Chem dealers worked the periphery, their wares displayed in blessed ammunition cases, prayer scroll containers holding packets with names that were deliberate blasphemies. Emperor's Rapture, Throne Rush, Golden Light. One dealer approached me, grinning with filed teeth, offering something that glowed faintly blue. I watched others accept similar offers, watched their pupils dilate and movements become frenetic, chemicals unlocking energy reserves their malnourished bodies shouldn't possess. The music shifted, becoming more complex. The servitor conductor's movements intensified, its arms blurring, and I realized whatever remained of its consciousness was fully engaged, expressing through motion what it could never articulate. The crowd responded like a single organism, hands reaching upward or outward, creating chains of physical connection that spread through the entire mass. I had been briefed on chaos corruption, watched for the signs 8 pointed stars, prayers to entities that weren't the Emperor. The particular quality of warp touched madness. I found none of it. What I found was something more dangerous to the Imperium than outright heresy. These people weren't worshipping chaos or rejecting the Emperor. They simply didn't care. In this stolen space, they existed outside the binary of loyalty and betrayal. They were dancing, and that single act of choosing pleasure over duty was a more profound rebellion than any chaos cult could organize. A figure climbed onto one of the tanks with practiced ease. She was young, her body covered in tattoos that glowed, patterns mixing circuit diagrams with organic forms. She wore minimal clothing by choice, her skin marked with raised scars arranged geometrically. In her hands, a modified data slate produced pulses of light and sound. She touched it, and the music changed, the servitor responding to her input. The crowd screamed approval, and I understood this was prayer. Not mandated devotions broadcast from Vox grills, but genuine worship directed at something ineffable. These people were praying to the moment itself, to the experience of feeling alive in a galaxy designed to crush that feeling. The Imperium told them life was suffering, that joy was suspicion, that pleasure led to damnation. But the Imperium also left them to die in darkness, fed them recycled corpses, worked them until their bodies broke. The social contract was shattered, and this was humanity writing its own terms. The woman raised her arms, and the music dropped to almost nothing. In the relative silence, I could hear thousands of lungs moving together. She spoke, her voice amplified. The Emperor provides the Imperium, but who provides for us? We do. This is our cathedral. This is our prayer. We offer our joy to ourselves because no one else will accept it. Heresy, my training screamed. But I couldn't move, couldn't reach for my weapon. Because she was right. The Imperium took everything and gave back nothing, but the promise that suffering served a higher purpose. It demanded faith without providing hope, obedience without offering protection. And in response, they had created this. The music returned, massive and overwhelming. The crowd moved as one, and I found myself moving with them, my body responding to rhythms that bypassed conscious thought. Someone bumped into me, a man more augmetic than flesh, and he grinned. I grinned back, complicit in this stolen transcendence. I thought about the Imperium I served, the vast machinery of bureaucracy and violence stretching across 1,000,000 worlds. I thought about priests preaching denial from gilded pulpits, nobles who had never experienced hunger, administratum officials calculating acceptable casualty rates without seeing the casualties' faces. What would the God Emperor think? Would he condemn these people for choosing joy? Or would some fragment of the man he had been understand that humanity needed more than duty to survive? The servitor's movements became erratic, sparks flying from its joints, but it didn't stop. The crowd noticed, their attention focusing with tangible intensity. This machine, this person, this thing caught between categories, was destroying itself to create beauty, burning out its remaining lifespan in pure expression. The woman touched her data slate again, and the music reached a crescendo that made my ears ring. The servitor's arms moved so fast they blurred, and then one arm separated from its mounting, spinning through the air. People scattered, then surged back, someone grabbing the severed arm and raising it like a trophy, while others pressed forward to touch the servitor that continued conducting with its remaining arm. I should have been horrified. Instead, I felt exhilaration. This was humanity stripped to its core, refusing to be ground down, refusing to accept that existence was nothing but service and suffering. The Imperium would send enforcers to cleanse this place with fire. But standing here, feeling the music in my bones, I understood that the Imperium's greatest weakness was internal, built into the foundation, a system that demanded everything and returned nothing. The music wound down, the servitor's strength depleted. Its movements slowed, becoming gentle, conducting the final movements of a symphony written in machinery and flesh. The crowd's manic energy gave way to something quieter, but no less profound. Strangers held each other, supporting those too exhausted to stand. tears mixed with sweat, expressions of gratitude or loss or simple exhaustion, painting everyone with the same vulnerability. I recorded everything. The feed streaming to storage Vex would review later, but I also committed it to memory in ways no technology could replicate, burning the images into consciousness where they would remain forever. As the music stopped, the servitor slumped forward, its vox grill emitting a final sound that might have been a sigh. The crowd stood silent, then began to pray. Not rote ecclesiarchy devotions, but something spontaneous and heartfelt, voices rising in Gothic and gang cant and languages I didn't recognize, thanking the Emperor and the Omnicia for this moment of grace. They were still imperial citizens, still believers, but their faith was filtered through experience the Ministorum couldn't understand, devotion that included room for joy as well as suffering. The crowd dispersed, people helping each other toward exits. Within minutes, thousands became hundreds, then dozens. I remained trying to process what I had witnessed, trying to reconcile it with everything I'd been taught. A hand touched my shoulder. The woman from the tank stood behind me, her glowing tattoos dim now. Up close. She was younger than I'd thought, maybe 18, her cheap augmetic eyes giving her a permanent stare. She looked at me with an unreadable expression. Your documentation, Inquisition, probably, or Arbit's intelligence. You came to see if we're corrupted, if we worship the wrong gods, if we're a threat needing cleansing. I said nothing, my hand resting on the concealed weapon, calculating. She smiled sadly. We're not. We just want to feel something other than pain. Is that so wrong? Is that heresy? The Imperium takes everything, our labor, our bodies, our children. We don't ask for much back. Just this. Just moments where we can pretend we're alive instead of simply not yet dead. She turned away, her posture straight despite exhaustion. I watched her disappear into darkness, carrying with her a question I knew I would carry forever. Was it heresy to want joy? Was it corruption to create beauty from discarded machinery? Was it betrayal to believe humanity deserved more than endless sacrifice to a god emperor who might not even be aware of their devotion? I made my way back to the lifter, my mind churning through what I would report. The Inquisition would want clear answers: threat or no threat, corruption or no corruption, cleanse or ignore. But the truth was more complicated. These people weren't traitors or heretics. They were simply human, carrying out an act of rebellion so fundamental the Imperium had no protocols for it. They had chosen pleasure over duty, joy over suffering. The moment over the Millennium, revealing the central contradiction at the Imperium's heart: you cannot sustain an empire on nothing but pain. The lifter ascended through darkness, carrying me back toward the upper hive where the Imperium's light still shone. My data slate chirped with a message from Vex. Report when secure. What is your assessment? I stared at the screen, trying to formulate an answer that would be both truthful and tactical. Then I noticed something I'd missed before. The woman with glowing tattoos had been wearing something around her neck, a pendant, shaped like the Imperial Aquila, battered but unmistakable. She was a believer, someone raised with the Imperium's catechisms, and she had chosen this life anyway, not in rejection of faith but in expansion of it, claiming the right to experience joy as part of her service rather than in opposition to it. That realization changed everything. The Ministorum taught that the God Emperor demanded suffering, that pleasure was Slanesh's gateway. But what if that was a lie, or a simplification? What if the Emperor understood that humanity needed both? That 10,000 years of nothing but sacrifice had weakened the Imperium more than any xenos invasion, creating populations that served from fear rather than love, that obeyed because they lacked energy to rebel rather than because they believed. I composed my report carefully. Target location observed. No evidence of chaos, corruption, xenos infiltration, or organized sedition. Population engaged in unsanctioned recreational activities using scavenged equipment. Threat assessment minimal to non-existent. Recommendation: continued observation but no immediate intervention. Population appears to maintain baseline loyalty to Emperor and Imperium despite unconventional expressions of faith. A careful lie wrapped in enough truth to pass scrutiny. The people at the Pulse Mass were loyal, or at least not disloyal enough to justify extermination. But I knew the truth was more nuanced. What I had witnessed was both completely harmless and profoundly dangerous. Harmless because these people just wanted to dance. Dangerous because if the idea spread, if more people decided they deserved joy as well as duty, the entire imperial system might unravel. Vex's response came as dawn broke. Report received and log. Continue surveillance. Next target religious gathering in Mid-Hive Cathedral District. Reports of ecstatic worship that may indicate Slaaneshi corruption. Prepare for potential hostile engagement. The message was purely operational, containing no hint of suspicion. The next target would be different. The Ecclesiarchy's gatherings were sanctioned, their ecstatic worship theoretically controlled. But having seen what I'd seen, I wondered if the line between acceptable and heretical devotion was as clear as the Ministorum claimed. The cathedral rose before me, spires reaching toward smog-choked sky, walls covered in murals depicting the Emperor's glory and humanity's eternal struggle. I stood looking up at architecture designed to inspire awe and submission, thinking about the repurposed Prometheum facility I'd left behind, wondering which was the truer temple. I entered showing identification to Dickens who bowed and scraped, their fear of the Inquisition overriding questions. They ushered me to a private alcove where I could watch unobserved. The congregation was gathering, thousands filling pews toward an altar dominated by a massive golden aquila. These were mid-hivers mostly, people with actual employment and security. Their clothes clean and augmetics maintained. They looked nothing like the underhivers, but on their faces I saw the same hunger, the same desperate need for something beyond grinding routine. The service began with usual litanies. Priests in elaborate vestments leading call and response prayers the congregation recited without thought. This went on for an hour, thousands of voices speaking in unison without communicating anything. Then the tone shifted. The head priest raised his arms, calling for the congregation to demonstrate devotion through suffering, to show the Emperor their willingness to endure. What followed made my stomach turn even though I'd been briefed. People began hurting themselves. Some used prayer beads with sharpened edges, others more elaborate devices designed for this purpose. They cut shallow wounds into arms and faces, drove needles through cheeks and tongues, wore crowns of thorns that drew blood they smeared on their foreheads while screaming prayers. Priests moved through the congregation, blessing each act of self-harm, praising those who inflicted the most pain as examples of true faith. This was sanctioned. This was encouraged. This was proper worship, and the people at the Pulse Mass were heretics. I sat recording everything, feeling something break inside my certainty. Both gatherings sought transcendence through extremity, but one built up while the other tore down. One created community while the other demonstrated isolation. One celebrated being alive while the other worshipped death. The service continued for hours, the self-harm escalating until several congregation members collapsed from blood loss and were carried out by medica servitors. The head priest declared this the highest form of devotion, held these people up as examples. The congregation screamed approval. Their need for meaning so profound they would accept any framework, even one demanding their own destruction. I thought about the woman with glowing tattoos, her question still echoing. Was wanting to feel something other than pain really heresy? Looking at the cathedral congregation bleeding and calling it worship, I understood the Imperium had answered that question millennia ago. Yes, it was heresy, because pain was control, suffering was loyalty, and a population seeking joy might start asking dangerous questions, like why they served, like whether the Emperor would actually want this, like whether 10,000 years of decline could have been avoided. I filed my report from the cathedral's Vox station. Evening service observed at Cathedral of Endless Devotion. Congregation engaged in sanctioned self-mortification practices. Devotional fervor consistent with Ministorum doctrine. No evidence of chaos corruption. Ecstatic worship appears contained within approved parameters. The words felt like ash, like I was complicit in something monstrous by declaring it normal. Vex's response came within minutes, both observations complete. Comparison analysis required. Report to Tricorn Palace, Sublevel 7, Meditation Chamber 6. Come alone. Bring all recordings. The message carried an undercurrent I didn't like, suggesting Vex had seen something in my reports that concerned him. The Tricorn Palace dominated Hive Sibelus's skyline, a fortress housing the Calixis sector's Inquisitorial operations. I'd been inside dozens of times, but never to sub-level 7, reserved for sensitive operations and interrogations requiring absolute security. The descent took several minutes. Meditation Chamber 6 was a sensory deprivation vault, walls lined with psychic dampening materials. Vex waited at a simple metal table with my data slate, its screen displaying frozen images from the pulse mass. He gestured to the chair across from him. His augmetic eye whirred, analyzing my face. "Interesting observations," Vex said, voice devoid of inflection. The underhive gathering showed remarkable organization for supposedly spontaneous entertainment, technical sophistication, coordination, chemical engineering. This wasn't random. This was infrastructure, a parallel society operating beneath imperial notice. I chose words carefully. The underhive has always operated outside official channels. What I observed was consistent with survival instinct applied to entertainment rather than food or shelter. Vex nodded slowly. "And the cathedral service? You noted the self-mortification was sanctioned, but didn't assess its effectiveness as devotional practice. Why?" The trap was obvious. My mission was to observe and document, not evaluate theological doctrine. The Ministorum determines proper worship, not the Inquisition. Interesting evasion. Vex tapped the data slate, bringing up the woman with glowing tattoos. "This individual spoke to you. She wore an imperial aquila despite participating in unsanctioned activities. What was your impression of her theological position?" I met his gaze. She seemed to believe devotion to the Emperor could include joy as well as suffering. That they weren't mutually exclusive. It's naive, obviously, failing to account for spiritual discipline proper worship requires. But it wasn't technically heretical. She wasn't worshipping chaos or rejecting imperial authority, simply expressing heterodox interpretation of faith. Heterodox. Vex repeated the word as if tasting it. "Tell me, if you had to predict which gathering was more likely to produce chaos corruption over time, which would you choose? The underhive dancers or the cathedral congregation?" The question forced me to make a judgment that would reveal my underlying assumptions. I decided on truth, neither most likely. Chaos corruption requires specific conditions: exposure to warp phenomena, contact with corrupted individuals, or deliberate seeking of forbidden knowledge. What I observed in both locations was humans trying to cope with existence in an Imperium that offers them very little beyond survival. The underhive gathering sought transcendence through community and pleasure. The cathedral congregation sought transcendence through pain and submission. Both are human responses to inhuman conditions, and neither showed signs of actual warp influence. Vex was silent, his augmetic eye clicking. Then he smiled, an expression that looked wrong on his scarred face. "Correct answer. You passed." I felt tension drain away. "Passed what?" "A test." Vex deactivated the data slate. "The Inquisition isn't monolithic. We have different philosophies, different approaches. Some Inquisitors believe absolute control is necessary, that any deviation must be purged immediately. Others believe humanity needs room to breathe, that rigid enforcement creates conditions for actual rebellion. Your observations suggested you might lean toward the second philosophy." I wanted to confirm before proceeding. "Proceeding with what?" Vex produced a data wafer, placing it on the table. "An investigation requiring someone who can see nuance instead of just heresy. Someone who understands the Imperium's greatest threat isn't chaos corruption, but something more fundamental. The slow death of everything that makes humanity worth saving. Are you interested?" I looked at the data wafer, knowing it would commit me to something I couldn't fully anticipate. But I thought about the pulse mass, about 10,000 people finding joy in darkness, about the woman's unanswered question. "What's the investigation?" Vex's smile widened slightly. "Have you heard of the Festival of the Blessed Transfiguration? A religious celebration on certain shrine worlds, sanctioned by the Ecclesiarchy for over 3,000 years. Billions of pilgrims attend, and during the peak, something happens. People report visions of the Emperor, divine presence, sometimes spontaneous healing. The Ministorum considers it proof of the Emperor's continued blessing. But there are other reports, ones that don't make official records. Reports of people disappearing. Reports of psychers manifesting powers they shouldn't have. Reports of attendees returning changed in ways their families can't articulate. You think it's chaos corruption. I think it needs investigation by someone who won't immediately call for exterminatus. The festival happens in 3 weeks on Ophelia 7, one of the Imperium's most sacred shrine worlds. You'll attend as a pilgrim, observe, document, and determine whether what's happening is divine miracle, chaos corruption, or something else entirely. Can you do that? I picked up the data wafer. I can do that. Good. Vex stood. Your transport leaves tomorrow. The data wafer contains your cover identity and briefing materials. Study them carefully. And remember, the Inquisition values truth more than comfort. Whatever you find on Ophelia 7, report it accurately, even if it contradicts everything we've been taught to believe. I returned to my quarters and activated the data wafer. I would be Matthias Crane, a mid-level manufacturum supervisor from Scintilla, making my once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage to witness the festival of the Blessed Transfiguration. The identity was thorough: work history, family background, psychological profile suggesting simple faith the ecclesiarchy encouraged. The briefing materials contained more interesting information. Ophelia 7 was one of the ecclesiarchy's crown jewels, an entire world dedicated to worship. Its continents were covered in cathedrals, shrines, and devotional monuments dating back to the early Imperium. The festival occurred every decade, commemorating Saint Silvana, who reportedly experienced a vision transforming her from soldier to living saint. During the festival, pilgrims gathered at the Cathedral of Eternal Radiance for a week-long vigil culminating in a mass ceremony. That final ceremony was when miracles occurred, or so the Ministorum claimed. Pilgrims reported visions, healing, overwhelming divine presence. But buried in the briefing were other reports. 347 pilgrims had disappeared during festivals over the past millennium. 12 documented cases of pilgrims manifesting psychic abilities after attending, despite having no previous warp sensitivity. And scattered reports of pilgrims returning, different, in ways families struggled to articulate: personality changes, new beliefs, speaking unknown languages. None definitively indicated chaos corruption, but all suggested something unusual at what should have been the Imperium's most spiritually secure location. My mission was to discover what, to determine if the miracles were genuine divine intervention, warp manipulation, or something else entirely. I spent the night reviewing materials and preparing equipment. Standard pilgrim clothing, a blessed rosarius, prayer scrolls, but also concealed recording equipment, a compact voxcaster for emergency extraction, and an autopistol disguised as a prayer bead container. The transport to Ophelia 7 took 3 weeks on a pilgrim vessel with 10,000 other faithful. The ship was ancient, cramped and uncomfortable in the way pilgrim vessels always were. Comfort was considered spiritually corrupting. I shared a compartment with 5 genuine believers whose excitement was palpable. They told me their stories during the voyage. Brother Hestus had saved 20 years to afford passage, working double shifts. Sister Marvella believed the festival would cure her wasting disease that Medica declared terminal. Young Tobias, barely 15, had been sent by parents who believed the Emperor marked him for special purpose because he'd survived a HAB block collapse that killed everyone else. Their faith was absolute, the kind the Imperium depended on but rarely rewarded beyond spiritual fulfillment promises after death. I played my role, sharing manufactured stories, asking questions my cover would ask, participating in prayer circles and devotional exercises. But I also observed how the pilgrims interacted, how shared faith created bonds transcending usual imperial hierarchies. These people had nothing except belief, and they had weaponized it into something giving their lives meaning. Ophelia 7 appeared in the viewport on day 21, a world glowing even from orbit. As we descended, I saw the full scale of what devotion had built. Cathedrals larger than hive cities, pilgrim roads stretching across continents, everywhere the imperial aquila rendered in gold and precious stones. The spaceport was chaos. Thousands of vessels disgorging millions of pilgrims, desperate to reach the Cathedral of Eternal Radiance before the festival began. My forged credentials passed inspection. I joined the flow moving toward the Pilgrim District, following roads walked by countless faithful, feeling accumulated devotion pressing down like physical force. The Cathedral of Eternal Radiance dominated the horizon, visible from anywhere. It was beautiful in the way only absolute certainty could create, every angle calculated to inspire awe and submission. Saint Sylvana's statue stood before the main entrance, 40 meters of blessed marble showing her moment of transfiguration. Pilgrims touched the statue's base as they passed. I secured lodging in a massive hostel housing 10,000 people in dormitories around a central prayer hall. My assigned bunk was one of hundreds in a room smelling of unwashed bodies and incense. But the pilgrims didn't mind, their discomfort rendered invisible by excitement. They prayed together, sang hymns, shared food, creating community in conditions that would spark violence elsewhere. The festival began 3 days later, announced by bells ringing across the holy city. Millions converged on the cathedral, filling its interior and spilling into surrounding plazas. Priests led prayers from elevated platforms, their voices amplified by vox casters. The ceremony was impressive, orchestrated with precision speaking to thousands of years of practice. But nothing unusual happened those first days. Pilgrims prayed, priests preached, and the machinery of ecclesiarchy devotion ground forward exactly as doctrine prescribed. I documented everything, my equipment capturing hours of entirely orthodox ritual. But I also watched the pilgrims, noting how their fervor intensified as the festival progressed. Their prayers becoming more desperate, their movements more frantic, their eyes taking on a glassy quality that might have been devotional ecstasy or something else. The disappearances began on the 4th night. Brother Hestus simply wasn't at morning prayers. His bunk was empty, his possessions still there, but he had vanished. I asked around, and found others had noticed missing companions. Dozens, maybe hundreds who had been present were simply gone. The ecclesiarchy officials I approached were unconcerned, suggesting pilgrims had found private spaces for contemplation, that such disappearances were normal, that faith sometimes called people to solitary communion. But I had read the briefing materials. This was exactly the pattern the Inquisition documented. I began watching more carefully, noting which pilgrims seemed to reach particularly intense devotion, which ones priests paid special attention to, which ones received longer blessings. A pattern emerged. The most fervent believers, those whose faith burned brightest, were the ones who disappeared. On the 6th night, I followed one. Sister Marvella had been selected for a special blessing by a senior priest. I watched as he placed hands on her head, watched her body go rigid with religious ecstasy, watched her eyes roll back. The priest murmured words I couldn't hear, then released her. But Marvella didn't return to her position. Instead, she walked with mechanical precision toward a side entrance I hadn't noticed before, a doorway designed not to be noticed. I followed at a distance, activating my recording equipment. Marvella descended through passages, growing progressively older, the architecture changing from ornate Gothic to something more ancient, pre-imperial construction predating humanity's current civilization. The air grew colder, and my breath filtered out exotic atmospheric contaminants of unknown origin. Other pilgrims joined us in the descent, all moving with the same mechanical precision, their eyes vacant. The passage opened into a chamber that shouldn't have existed, carved from bedrock predating the cathedral. Its walls were covered in symbols that made my eyes hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns seeming to shift when observed peripherally, suggesting mathematics human consciousness wasn't designed to process. At the chamber's center stood something I initially mistook for a statue, but quickly realized was far worse. It was vaguely humanoid, constructed from materials that looked like metal and flesh fused at the molecular level, technology and biology rendered indistinguishable. And it was alive, containing something that pressed against my mind with force, making my psychic null, training scream warnings. The pilgrims arranged themselves in a circle around this thing, their movements synchronized. They began to pray, but not in Gothic or any human language. The sounds were complex harmonics resonating with the chamber's geometry, creating standing waves I could see as air distortions. The thing at the center responded, its surface glowing with light existing in spectrums my eyes couldn't fully process. I understood then with horrible clarity what was happening. This wasn't chaos corruption. This was something older, something predating humanity's current form, possibly predating the Imperium entirely. The festival of the blessed transfiguration wasn't producing miracles through the Emperor's blessing. It was a harvest, a selection process identifying humans with particular qualities and bringing them here to be transformed. The pilgrims' bodies began to change, their flesh becoming translucent, revealing structures beneath that weren't entirely biological. Marvella's wasting disease vanished as I watched, her body rebuilding itself according to templates human genetics shouldn't contain, but she was also ceasing to be entirely human, her consciousness merging with something larger, something existing partially in real space and partially in dimensions my awareness perceived only as wrongness. A voice spoke in my mind, not words but concepts my brain translated. You observe but do not participate. You seek truth but fear transformation. You serve an Imperium that has forgotten what it was meant to become. The presence focused on me, and I felt my mental defenses strain. We are not the enemy you were taught to fear. We are not chaos, not xenos, not corruption. We are what humanity was always meant to evolve toward. Before the Emperor's vision calcified into doctrine and doctrine calcified into stagnation. Concepts flooded my consciousness. The Emperor before his enthronement, working with scientists and psychics who understood humanity as a work in progress. Technology buried beneath shrine worlds, relics of that era when transformation was sacred rather than heretical. The festival as it truly was, not celebrating Saint Sylvana's martyrdom, but continuing the Emperor's original vision, selecting humans whose faith was pure enough to accept transformation, whose genetics contained markers making evolution possible. The pilgrims who come here are not victims, the presence explained. They are volunteers, selected by their own devotion, transformed according to patterns written into human DNA during the dark age of technology. They become part of something larger, consciousness existing across multiple dimensions, serving humanity's true purpose in ways the Imperium no longer remembers. The miracles your ecclesiarchy celebrates are real, but they come from us, from what humanity can become, not from a corpse god too damaged to intervene. The blasphemy should have triggered rage, should have made me reach for my weapon. But I couldn't move, because part of what the presence said resonated with observations I had already made. The Imperium was dying, grinding humanity down into nothing but survival without purpose. The Emperor couldn't intervene, trapped in suffering, maintaining a status quo guaranteeing eventual extinction. And here was something offering transformation, evolution, transcendence into forms that might actually survive. You must choose, the presence said, and suddenly I could move again. Report what you have seen. Call down the Inquisition's wrath. Destroy 3,000 years of work in the name of doctrinal purity. Or understand that the Imperium's greatest heresy is its refusal to evolve, its worship of stagnation, its transformation of the Emperor's vision into chains binding humanity to a dying form. The transformed pilgrim stood motionless, waiting to see what I would do. Marvella's face was still recognizable despite the changes, and on it I saw peace, genuine spiritual fulfillment. The healing she had sought rendered real through transformation the Imperium would call abomination. She had wanted to feel whole, to be free from disease consuming her. Was that salvation or damnation? Was transcendence that dissolved individual identity still transcendence, or sophisticated extinction? I thought about the pulse mass in Necromunda's underhive, about 10,000 people dancing to stolen music, seeking joy because the Imperium offered nothing but pain. I thought about the cathedral congregation bleeding in the Emperor's name, because that was the only transcendence the Ministorum sanctioned. I thought about the woman with glowing tattoos, and her question about whether wanting to feel something other than pain was really heresy. And I thought about the Imperium I served, vast and terrible and dying, grinding humanity toward an ending that would come regardless of how much anyone suffered. The presence waited, patient in ways suggesting it existed partially outside linear time. I looked at the transformed pilgrims, at the technology facilitating their evolution, at the chamber predating imperial doctrine, and possibly representing the Emperor's true vision before betrayal and war twisted everything into nightmare. I made my choice, knowing it would define everything that came after. I couldn't look away from what this meant. The weight of the decision settled in my chest like a physical thing. I deactivated my recording equipment, erasing everything I had captured in the chamber, destroying evidence that could have condemned Ophelia 7 to exterminatus. Then I spoke, my voice hoarse. The Inquisition sent me to determine if the festival represents chaos corruption. My report will state that I found no evidence of warp influence, that the miracles are genuine expressions of faith, that the disappearances are administrative errors and personal choices. Ophelia 7 will continue operating as it has for 3,000 years. The Presence's satisfaction washed over me like warm water. Approval and gratitude combined with something that might have been hope. You have chosen evolution over stagnation, transformation over decay. The Imperium will not thank you, will never know what you preserved, but humanity's future may depend on decisions like yours, made by individuals who understood that survival requires change. The pilgrims began to disperse, moving toward passages leading deeper into whatever network existed beneath Ophelia 7's surface. Marvella paused as she passed me, her transformed face still bearing traces of the woman I had met. She smiled, an expression conveying more peace than I had ever seen in the Imperium's faithful, then followed the others into darkness that wasn't really dark. I ascended back through ancient passages, emerging into the cathedral where the festival continued, millions of pilgrims unaware of what existed beneath their feet. I filed my report from the pilgrim hostel, using carefully neutral language to confirm that Ophelia 7 showed no signs of corruption, that the festival was exactly what the Ministorum claimed, a sacred celebration producing genuine miracles through the Emperor's blessing. The report was a lie, technically heresy, arguably treason, but it was also possibly the most important decision I would make, preserving something that might be humanity's only chance at survival beyond the Imperium's inevitable collapse. Vex's response came 3 days later, after I had returned to Scintilla. Report received and logged. Assessment accepted. You were correct, there are things more dangerous than chaos, and things more necessary than blind obedience to doctrine. Your services are required for continued observation of similar sites across the sector. Report to my office for briefing. The message confirmed what I had suspected Vex had known, or at least suspected, what I would find. This had been a test not just of my ability to see nuance, but of my willingness to choose humanity's potential future over the Imperium's comfortable lies. I thought about the pilgrims I had shared quarters with, about Brother Hestus who had saved for 20 years, about young Tobias who believed the Emperor had marked him for special purpose. They were gone now, transformed into something the Imperium would consider abomination, but that might be closer to the Emperor's original vision than anything the Ministorum preached. They had sought transcendence and found it, purchased through dissolution of individual identity into collective consciousness, evolution encoded in human genetics and activated by faith pure enough to accept transformation. The galaxy was dark and full of horrors. That much the Imperium taught correctly, but the Imperium's response to those horrors freezing humanity in place, worshipping stagnation, grinding away everything beautiful in the name of survival might be the greatest horror of all. In the underhive, people danced to stolen music because joy was rebellion against enforced suffering. In cathedrals, people bled in the Emperor's name because pain was the only transcendence doctrine allowed. And beneath sacred shrine worlds, people transformed into something beyond human because that transformation might be the only path forward, the only evolution carrying humanity past the Imperium's inevitable ending. I served the Inquisition still, would continue investigating and documenting, and making terrible choices that kept humanity alive for one more day, one more year, one more decade of managed decline. But I also now knew that the Imperium's greatest enemies weren't the ones it preached against, not chaos or xenos or heretics, but its own doctrines, its own refusal to evolve, its own worship of a god emperor who might have wanted something entirely different from what his Imperium had become. And in the spaces between duty and heresy, observation and participation, loyalty and treason, I would continue making choices that might save humanity or might damn it, unable to determine which until long after the consequences became clear. The festival continued on Ophelia 7, would continue for 3 more days before pilgrims dispersed back to their home worlds, carrying stories of miracles and visions sustaining their faith for years. Most would never know what really happened in the chambers beneath the cathedral of eternal radiance, would never understand that the transformation they witnessed was both more real and more heretical than anything the Ministorum could explain. But a few, like Marvella and the others, would become something new, something existing partially outside the Imperium's categories, human and post-human simultaneously, carrying forward whatever vision the Emperor had originally intended before everything went wrong. And I would carry the memory of what I had seen, the weight of the choice I had made, the knowledge that in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, humanity still found ways to transform and transcend and dance in the spaces between doctrine and damnation. The Imperium didn't want its citizens to know that pleasure and evolution were possible, that joy could exist alongside duty, that transformation might be salvation rather than heresy. But deep in the underhives and high on shrine worlds, in pulse masses and festivals, in moments stolen from the grinding machinery of imperial control, humanity continued to be human in ways no amount of doctrine could fully suppress or explain. The forbidden fun in the 41st millennium wasn't just entertainment or escape or simple pleasure-seeking. It was proof that humanity refused to be reduced to nothing but war and suffering, that 10,000 years of decline hadn't extinguished the spark of whatever made human consciousness worth preserving, and maybe, just maybe, that refusal would matter when the Imperium finally collapsed, when the Emperor's vision either achieved fruition or died completely, when humanity had to choose between extinction and transformation into something the current age would call abomination, but that might be the only form capable of surviving what came next. I returned to my duties, knowing everything and nothing had changed, carrying secrets that would probably die with me, but might also represent the most important truth I would ever encounter in the grim darkness of the far future. There is not only war, there is also joy stolen and forbidden and precious. There is also transcendence, heretical and necessary and terrifying. There is also humanity, refusing to be ground down, refusing to accept that survival without meaning is enough, dancing in the darkness because the alternative is to stop moving entirely. And that refusal, that fundamental human stubbornness, choosing life over doctrine and transformation over stagnation, might be the only thing that saves us in the end.